This is Algeria, the country where about 46 million people live on a vast area of more than 2.3 million square kilometers, making Algeria the largest African and Arab country and the 10th largest country on Earth. But the Algeria we know now was under French occupation only about 70 years ago. For France, Algeria was not just a French colony, but it was treated as a part of its land that it would never give up no matter what happened. That is why the idea of France leaving Algeria was almost impossible, and the war in Algeria was bloody and long, and millions of Algerians died during it. During this war, Algeria wrote one of the greatest stories of resistance and steadfastness in human history. But the question that arises is, how did France succeed in occupying Algeria? And how did Algeria literally come back from the dead and defeat France after an occupation that lasted 132 years? To understand the full story, we need to go back to the beginning of the 16th century, specifically in 1516. At that time, the Ottoman Empire was controlling Algeria and many Muslim countries, and Algeria was one of the most powerful countries in the Mediterranean Sea and had a strong naval fleet that was able to almost completely control the Mediterranean Sea. At that time, most of the major European countries, including France, Britain, and Spain, were forced to pay an annual fee to Algeria in exchange for protecting their ships and crossing safely. For the Ottoman Empire, Algeria had a special place, and that is why Algeria was a semi-independent state and had political and commercial relations with most countries of the world. One of these countries is France, where a revolution against the king took place in 1789 and lasted about 10 years. During this period, France was suffering as a result of the European siege, and the economic conditions in it deteriorated greatly. Here, Algeria intervened and sent France shipments of wheat and meat and provided it with financial loans. So France was able at that time to eliminate the famine that was threatening its population. But after the debts accumulated on France, it finally refused to pay these debts to Algeria. And what was worse was that it began to plan to occupy Algeria. Here it faced only one problem, which is the strong naval fleet that Algeria possesses. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire began to weaken, and at that time, it was called the sick man of Europe. Here, many of the colonial European countries began to covet the lands that the Ottoman Empire controls, and many of the European countries began to demand independence. One of these countries is Greece, where a major revolution took place against the Ottoman Empire. Here, the Ottoman Empire resorted to the states affiliated with it, and one of these states was Algeria. Here, the Algerian fleet moved towards Greece to fight the Battle of Navarin in 1827 between the Ottoman Empire and the major European countries. The war ended with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the victory of France, Britain, and Russia, and the Algerian naval fleet was destroyed. Here, all the conditions were ready for France to occupy Algeria. About 6 months before the Battle of Navarin, after the ruler of Algeria, Dey Hussein, sent letters and telegrams to France and demanded that France pay the debts it owed, but France did not respond to Dey Hussein's letters. After that, Dey Hussein invited the French consul to visit him and asked him about the reason for the French government's delay in responding to him. But the French consul responded to him in a provocative way and told him that his government would not lower itself and respond to someone like him. At that time, Dey Hussein was holding a fan in his hand, so he waved it towards the French consul, and it almost touched his face. And after that, he expelled him. France considered this situation an insult to its prestige and took it as an excuse to occupy Algeria. That is why France began to impose a siege on Algeria that lasted for 3 years, and in the end, France declared war on Algeria in 1830. After a series of battles, Dey Hussein was forced to surrender on July 5th, 1830. So France finally succeeded in entering Algeria, and the period of French occupation of Algeria began. During the French occupation of Algeria, France followed the scorched earth policy and began the war of genocide to eliminate the resistance of the Algerian people from the beginning. They began to fight the Arabic language and forced the people to use the French language to be the official language in Algeria. France changed the names of cities, streets, and landmarks and turned them into French names. And students in schools and universities began to study the geography and history of France as if they were the geography and history of Algeria. Many mosques were demolished, and a large number of them were converted into churches. The French seized the best agricultural lands, confiscated properties, and expelled the tribes from their lands. And these lands were handed over by France to the French and European settlers who moved to Algeria. The Algerians were forced to have a license to move from one place to another so that the Algerian would live at that time as if he were a stranger in his own home. In eastern Algeria, the resistance against the French occupation began led by Ahmed Bey. And in western and central Algeria, the resistance began led by a 24-year-old young man, Prince Abdelkader. Prince Abdelkader formed an army that combined all Algerians and began to re-establish the Algerian state and government. He made for himself a mobile capital that moved constantly, and its population reached about 3,000 people. This mobile capital consisted of thousands of tents that migrated from one place to another and were protected by artillery and military detachments. Prince Abdelkader had strong relations with arms dealers in Europe, and this made his army use advanced weapons in the face of the French forces, and the number of his army reached about 16,000 soldiers. At that time, France had political turmoil, and the supplies coming from France to the French forces in Algeria began to decrease. Here, Prince Abdelkader took advantage of this opportunity and announced a complete halt to trade with the French and issued a decision to punish any Algerian who deals with the French. So a famine occurred among the French forces. At that time, when the French forces left their areas and carried out a sweep or reconnaissance of the areas around them, Prince Abdelkader's forces would attack and eliminate them. So Prince Abdelkader succeeded in achieving successive victories against the French occupation. For the French, what Prince Abdelkader was doing was an insult to the prestige of France. That is why France gathered its forces and headed to the city of Mascara in western Algeria and launched an attack on Prince Abdelkader's forces. But the prince's forces lured the French forces and defeated them. So a young man, less than 26 years old, succeeded in defeating one of the strongest armies in the world. After that, France moved tens of thousands of its soldiers towards Algeria, and their first goal was to eliminate the Algerian resistance led by Prince Abdelkader. But Prince Abdelkader's forces continued to carry out military operations against the French forces. That is why in 1837, France signed the Treaty of Tafna with Prince Abdelkader. Here, France recognized Prince Abdelkader's sovereignty over an area estimated at 2/3 of the current area of Algeria. France, before signing this treaty, was facing resistance in western Algeria led by Prince Abdelkader, and in eastern Algeria, it was facing resistance led by Ahmed Bey. But as soon as this treaty was signed, France moved all its forces towards eastern Algeria so that the occupation finally succeeded in controlling the city of Constantine and defeating Ahmed Bey in 1877. Here, France was free for Prince Abdelkader. That is why France asked Prince Abdelkader to give up some lands, but the prince refused, and here the war returned again between the prince's forces and the French occupation. If we look at the map of the distribution of mountains in Algeria, we will find that the mountains are widely spread in the areas located in the north of Algeria on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. The mountains located in the north of Algeria absorb the humidity that comes from the Mediterranean Sea and carry it through the wind, and this leads to rain falling on the small area located on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In addition, the high altitude of these mountains above sea level makes the weather in them much colder than the areas located at the same sea level. That is why the weather here is much better than the rest of the areas of Algeria, which are mostly dry desert lands inhabited by a small number of residents and are almost devoid of any form of urbanization, unlike the areas located in the north, where the mountains are widespread and the vast majority of the population lives. These mountainous areas have fertile soil, green spaces, and forests extending over large areas, and this makes their management or even monitoring a very difficult task. That is why Prince Abdelkader's forces used these areas in the war against the French occupation and began to set ambushes and lure the French forces into the midst of the mountains. So this area became an area of terror for the French forces. At that time, France carried out military campaigns and began a war of genocide with the aim of eliminating the resistance led by Prince Abdelkader. It began to kill children, women, and the elderly, and burned the villages and cities that supported the prince. This made many of the tribes that supported Prince Abdelkader have to abandon him and declare loyalty to France. So France finally succeeded in eliminating the prince's mobile capital in May 1843. At that time, Prince Abdelkader withdrew into the lands of Morocco, which was supporting him with weapons and money. So the Battle of Isly took place between the Moroccan army and the French army in 1844. The battle ended with the victory of France and the defeat of the Moroccan army. So the Sultan of Morocco was forced after that to sign the Treaty of Lalla Magna in 1845, the provisions of which included Morocco's cessation of support for the Algerian resistance and considering Prince Abdelkader an outlaw. From that time on, the strength of the resistance led by the prince began to decrease even more, and the idea of continuing the resistance against the French occupation became an almost impossible task, especially after the number of French forces in Algeria reached about 100,000 soldiers. Here, Prince Abdelkader was forced to declare his surrender on the condition that France pledged security for all his soldiers and allow them to return to their tribes. So in 1847, Prince Abdelkader was exiled and finally settled in Damascus. After the elimination of Prince Abdelkader's resistance, other resistance movements appeared in different areas of Algeria, but France dealt with them in the most heinous ways and succeeded in eliminating them. So France almost controlled all of Algeria's lands and declared that Algeria was a French province and an integral part of France's land. In 1867, a famine occurred in Algeria that killed hundreds of thousands of Algerians. Here, life in Algeria became a hell, and a large number of Algerians decided to immigrate from their lands, so the population of Algeria was almost halved after a period. From that time on, the number of European settlers in Algeria began to increase significantly, so their number finally reached about 1 million people. Here, Algerians were suffering from poverty and hunger at a time when the Europeans living in Algeria had all the means of comfort and luxury available to them. At the beginning of the 20th century, and with the continued suffering of Algerians, France recruited a large number of Algerians, whose number reached about 170,000 Algerian soldiers during the First World War, and during the Second World War, France promised Algerians to end the occupation if France won the war. So about 130,000 Algerian soldiers participated with France against Nazi Germany. The Second World War ended on May 8, 1845, and the defeat of Nazi Germany was announced. At that time, the French came out in all parts of France to celebrate the victory. And on the same day, Algerians came out to celebrate the end of the Second World War and demand the independence that France had promised them. But at that time, France bombed the Algerian villages in Setif, Constantine, and Guelma, and committed massacres against Algerians. So more than 45,000 Algerians were killed in these massacres. 9 years later, specifically in 1954, the establishment of the National Liberation Front was announced, and at the same time, this front formed the National Liberation Army, and the start of the armed resistance against the French occupation was announced. So the Algerian War of Liberation began on November 1st, 1954. The revolution began with a gathering of about 1,200 Algerian fighters with traditional weapons to begin organized military operations in different areas of Algeria. France tried to eliminate the Algerian Revolution in its beginnings, so it issued a decision on November 5th to dissolve all Algerian political bodies, and more than 500 members of the Liberation Front were arrested. At the same time, France began a war of genocide and committed massacres against the Algerian people, but the Algerian resistance continued to carry out military operations against the French occupation. After that, a general strike occurred with which the Algerian people interacted greatly, and this increased the pressure on France. At that time, the Prime Minister of France came out and invited the Liberation Front to reconciliation, but for Algerians, independence was the first and last goal. That is why, on September 19th, 1958, the establishment of the Provisional Algerian Government was announced under the presidency of Farhat Abbas, but the French government continued the war of genocide and massacres until 1962. At that time, negotiations between the Liberation Front and France began, so the two parties finally agreed to hold a popular referendum for independence, and the referendum was actually held. And Algerians supported the option of independence by a percentage of 99.7%. So in the end, the independence of Algeria was announced on July 5th, 1962, after an occupation that lasted for 132 years and millions of the Algerian people died in it. So Algeria returned to life again after the Algerians wrote one of the greatest stories of resistance and steadfastness.